There is one question that is typically left out of mainstream discussions. Who is most influenced and at risk from the development and deployment of AI technologies?
Thank you very much for that question. And let me say, it is indeed an honor and a privilege to be with you today. An excellent question when we think about who is impacted most by AI. And I think we are all impacted by AI because what we are seeing is the fact that there is no AI without data. And the data that's being used to design and develop and deploy this technology is our data. So questions around monetization, weaponization, suppression, and oppression, questions around justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, questions around fairness and trust and ethics and accountability and transparency, questions around agency and autonomy and self-determination, and how do we develop our identity in a space that is data-driven. I think what we're talking a lot now in AI is about bias and discrimination, and how do we harness the rewards of this technology while mitigating the risks and upholding the rights and building resilient societies. So much conversation around responsible technology, trustworthy AI, and of course, how do we do this technology ethically? How do we build the ethical vigilance that is required to bring the requisite levels of oversight and compliance? How do we motivate our leaders to govern this space, to regulate, to enforce? And how do we have conversations among our stakeholders and in various communities about the ways in which we are using this technology and the ways in which this technology is using us?
Absolutely. And that's an important question and an important framing. How is this technology using us, right? It's a figure and ground reversal. And I would love to now go to Julie, who recently has been focused on youth tech and well-being. And when we speak about the most vulnerable, youth are a particularly affected population because they don't have a seat at the table when it comes to decision making. They are not yet fully developed. So what are the key issues facing youth today regarding policy? And how can policy center privacy and long-term resilience, as Renée pointed out, for those who can't be at the table?
So one of the big movements around the world is looking at age-appropriate design. And that really is looking at how do we enable young people to thrive online of all ages. And one of the key tricky areas for everyone, people of all ages, is how do we trust who we're engaging with? Be that a company, be that someone we're talking to online. So for the youngest people, one of the key things is how do we make that environment one they can thrive? Because there are so many things that they can avail of. So our company looks at how do people prove who they are or how old they are, face-to-face and online. And we do that in a whole range of different methods. But one of the things we have to do is make sure, building on Renée's point, that that is fair, that the bias is transparent, that it's clear how you're doing it, what's under the hood. So one of the key things we have from the people under this roof today is a variety of stakeholders, people from civil society, people from regulatory bodies, people from NGOs. And our role is to listen to those people and ensure that we're building this so that young people are part of that discussion, doing co-creation, looking so that young people's voices are heard. I think UNICEF put down an excellent gauntlet about 2 years ago, which was making AI principles, making them understandable for young people. And lo and behold, when you do that, you actually found that most of Joe Public can understand as well. So the understandability, making something clear and understandable by a young person, is valid for all ages. And that's a key element within age-appropriate design, is making sure the policies, making sure the support that you offer are ones that can be understood by the people using them and involving them in that process. So I would almost take some issue with your point that they can't be at the table. We have to change that. that frame of mind. And we have to bring young people to the table, as well as listening to the NGOs and bodies that are already there representing them. Because without that, we are not really looking at making, this to be tech to be human. We're only looking at it through a specific lens. And if we want to ensure that people of all ages that can participate, it's important that those bias elements and the inclusion are there for people with documents and without documents. And that's one of the things we look at. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And inviting a multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary approach and centering transparency is so critical and so key to building resilient futures for artificial intelligence and beyond. And I really love how each question has naturally bridged one to another, and especially those answers. And speaking of transparency and inviting more folks to the table to help co-create this better tech future, John-Orr, in your role, it is your job to keep people safe online. So what are the central challenges to keeping people of not just youth spaces, but all spaces, right? A multi-generational approach includes folks that are not typically included in the conversation, and those are usually elder folks as well, right? When we speak about digital literacies and access to them, a lot of times things that younger generations take for granted are very difficult for other generations, right? So how can we keep people of all generations safe, and how can we begin to implement those changes?
Brilliant, thank you. So I think one of the key observations from us at CRISP, I guess, is the size and pace of change. So I guess if we think about what thinking to Aaron Saltman's comments earlier, like how many apps do you have on your phone? If we asked that question like 10 years ago, we'd be probably in single digits. So now as we look at, I guess, a wide range of different users, the internet becoming much more accessible to a much wider audience, be it in terms of generational access, but actually as we look forward in terms of pace of change, not only are more types of users accessing services, but those services are also changing. So be it everything from ordering food online, accessing knowledge, accessing what you think is a source of truth, maybe not, all the way through to interacting for recreational purposes, be it in gaming or in another environment. Each of these requires a really strong assessment, as Julie Renée has said, around which users are going to be using your services. What are they going to be able to do on that? What should they be able to do, and what shouldn't they be able to do? So again, thinking about safety by design. As we move then, looking at not just the range and pace of services, but as the internet becomes much more available globally, the solutions that we should be looking at in terms of development should really take in, a much greater and global basis, and and a clear understanding around bias. So we should be building global solutions for a global internet audience. And I think really until maybe 5 years ago, we hadn't quite got there. Much more discussion in the last 5 years. Certainly as we look at services that really take into account culture, but especially language. We've seen challenges, be it in Europe, around, services, protections, trust and safety capabilities that maybe don't take in the full language set. We're talking about dozens and dozens of new language sets going forward that we need to start developing now, so that when those services are in different communities, different cultures, different spaces globally, that we have a response, we have a capability for that. I think everybody's built services in response in English. We're into kind of 50, 60, 70 languages now coverage. And I think going forward, that number's only going to grow. So I guess to surmise, I think it's which users will use your services, which demographic, which cultures and language sets, and how are we designing services that recognize all of that and build, I guess, as safe an experience as possible.
I really appreciate that you are taking a global approach to building guardrails for the future, because multi-generational approaches require multi-generational representation, and we all have different perspectives about the issues that we face, and we all come from multiple backgrounds and disciplines. I would love for all of you, even in conversation and not isolated, to discuss what you believe the biggest threat to human autonomy in a digital age is. John-Orr, I couldn't help but notice that you said that there is an access gap, and you implied that access gap of folks and demographics that will continue to grow. So what is the biggest threat to human autonomy in a digital age, and how can tech policy help to create those better guardrails?
Thank you. I think the biggest threat to human autonomy at this stage is the algorithm. When we think about the algorithm, and when we think about how an algorithm is designed, and when we think about the fact that an algorithm has the ability to make a decision about you without you knowing a decision has been made, then you understand how an algorithm can undermine your agency, your autonomy, your self-determination, your access to opportunities and resources, your ability to build a thriving legacy. And one of the things I always speak about with algorithms is that an algorithm has the ability to deploy a legacy. And as data scientists and individuals working in the space, we have got to think about the legacy that's being deployed. We know when we think about bias and discrimination, we're speaking often about underserved, high-needs communities, marginalized communities that do not have visibility and voice in this space. But I think all of us have got to think about data, decision-making, due process, and democracy. And what an algorithm has is the ability to undermine due process in real time.
I agree with those points. I think I'd like to take it from the view of a small company. We started off as a company of 5 people almost 9-10 years ago, and now are nearly 500. So we've seen that transition of how can a really small company start to look at how the hell do you do things the right way. You don't often start with a 20-person ethics board to guide you. If you had the support of half the people in this room, that would be pretty good. But we've got a lot of small companies. The vast majority of innovators will be SMEs. I was talking to someone earlier that was doing great work with Digital Catapult on their ethics support for their incubees, but not all startups have that. And for me, one of the things that I think is imperative and would be good if a lot more of the people around this room think is how can we help those small and scaling organizations to be thoughtful about how they're going about, to go through those elements that Renée has discussed. We are fortunate in our organisation that literally from the get-go, we set up as a B corporation, looking at the triple bottom line, and brought in people to guide us, because what we're doing is so fundamental with age and identity on the areas of human rights, consumer rights, last mile tech, accessibility, transparency. But that's 1 in 1,000 little tiny companies that in the first sort of 6 months of life try to do that. And many others will not know where to start. Even just looking at the good AI regs this last year, it's taken several of my team 6 months to even decide which framework to start with. And that's being very honest, it's not easy. So how do we support those small organizations to build that capacity is for me one of the big challenges on a real practical level. Because lots of organizations are coming up with tremendous tomes, but there's so much of it to get through. Where do people start?
Thanks, Jim. I think for me, looking across the space, looking at where we are now, and I guess the threats of getting things wrong, I think what stands out for me is really pragmatic regulation. And that goes sort of both ways. So yes, we have to have some rules and we have to have some understanding of what today looks like and what's safe and what good looks like. But also really, in the regulation space, the style of engagement between industry and between the regulator, and that being really collegiate and focused on outcomes, rather than being a tick box exercise. When we look at the scale and the pace with which the environment changes, really what you want is, I don't necessarily want an organization that can tick all the tick boxes better than the next one. I want an organization that demonstrates that it understands the risks that it may or may not have within its country, within its environment as an industry player, but also the ability to pragmatically deal with that risk, discharge it, and actually move on to the next thing. I think as we go forward, as we've seen over the last, let's say, 25 years, the rate of change, the rates of new risks and challenges in the space is only going to accelerate. What we really want is an organization, an ecosystem that can identify those risks, triage them collectively in terms of which ones are most important, and then deploy responses to those as quickly and effectively and arguably as cheaply as possible so that we can get on and deal with the next thing, because there's always going to be a next thing. So really, would be not to get too bogged down in overly detailed regulation now, but being focused on a pragmatic way of doing that, and really, ironically, putting a lot of trust between the regulator and everybody else in that ecosystem so that we can move as quickly as possible. Everybody's not going to get it right first time, but really it's about working together and being much more proactive and focused on an outcome that everybody can get behind.
Just a couple of other things that I think is how can regulators themselves embrace technology in their landscape review and also support companies? How can we look at a model whereby we don't wait for the whistleblower to happen, but we're supporting people inside their companies to blow that whistle earlier or to be part of internal ethics groups that are able to make their voices heard? So I don't know if Renée's any other thoughts on that, but my end of the spectrum is really where the rubber hits the road. And I think, I'm in a company of now 500 people, but I saw how hard it was on the journey. And I just think we've got to think a lot more practically, because the regulators will always put their attention on the big guys, on the companies that are, 250 people plus, probably. But you can get the next innovation coming out of the 5-man garage. And so how do we help the vast majority of companies on the journey?
Thank you so much. I think one of the challenges we've realized is that we need real-time governance. And real-time governance is one of the most challenging things to deploy, because the technology is changing so quickly, the frequency of deployment so insane, and the fact that so much is being reconfigured in a very short space of time. And as you said, we don't know where the next big deployment is going to come from. But one of the things that we do know is that the garage is a place, or the bedroom, a teen's bedroom, could be the next big place. So it's really about how do we get the governance moving? How do we upskill the regulators? And then the other question around trust, and of course accountability and transparency, is that we have realized when we think about regulators, that regulators have failed us many times before.
Yeah, I really appreciated the exchange, and I think it's the perfect segue to the final question of this panel, which is, we're all gathered here at the Shard because we're interested in the future of tech and democracy. The two are inextricably intertwined. And with that in mind, I'm curious, in order to help better co-create that tech future, what is one thing, one key outcome that you would like to see in tech policy that helps us co-create that better future, as well as any advice that you would have for folks in the audience who are interested in becoming more involved than they already are?
I think the key bit in the policy, I think I keep coming back to my other comment about it being pragmatic. If it's a massive tome, to Zoe's point or to Renée's point, it just doesn't scale, it's not accessible, people can't start making it real. And I think while there will obviously be focus on the larger organizations, there's many more communities around that need practical regulation that can actually drive positive engagement. So I think I come back to being as pragmatic as possible, and it being much more of a partnership style engagement between all of the, rather than less, I guess it could be adversarial, which I think would be less useful.
I would say the question of power, because we know this is a very powerful technology. We know it has extraordinary promise, but we also know that there are great pitfalls. And when we think about this technology, particularly at the intersection of technology and democracy, we've got to think about one word, and that is justice. And it's not only justice for the underserved, marginalized, minoritized, or vulnerable communities, it is justice for all of us. Because any tool or any algorithm or any system that has the ability to make a decision about you without you being involved in that process. It means that you have given up an extraordinary amount of your rights to technology. And if that technology makes a decision about you, given the fact that data is now our DNA, that technology is not only making a decision about you, but it's making a decision about your legacy, about your access, about your resources, and about generations to come. So I think for me, it is the question of justice that brought me to this space, and justice remains one of the most critical questions about data, democracy, and AI.
Thank you. And the one last thing I would add to that is we need to invite scrutiny to what we're doing, which can be quite uncomfortable. But the one word I would put is, sunlight is that best oxygen. And if we make it so that ahead of the whistleblowers, people within companies, and you and I as, users, consumers, everyday people, ask those awkward questions, say what makes you feel uncomfortable, and that companies get used to the fact that people will be empowered to find routes to whistleblow. And so the better preemptive strike is to have those internal routes for people to make their voice heard, and for us as consumers and people to ask awkward questions and to require and demand that things be made understandable. Lift the hood, basically, so that there's more openness.
Julie, thank you so much. Everyone give it up for our panelists, Renée Cummings, John-Orr Hanna, and Julie Dawson. Thank you all so much.